panel of the international seminar called by Inside Law, the University of Rosario, called Adapting to the Virus, Criminal Mutations, the COVID-19 has changed the uh, agenda in the world, and organized crime has um, also done it. The organized crime in the region has transformed, and we have the following questions: how the criminal landscape has changed, and how this COVID has affected the criminal landscape. With us, we have Arlene of the University of Rosario. The panel is made of Stephen Bartley, Angelica Duran, and Carolina Sampo. We remind the participants that in the end we will have a space to answer the questions, so you can participate in the chat of the event or through Facebook and Twitter. Likewise, to listen to the English version of the event, you can click at the bottom of your screen. Thank you very much, Arlene. Welcome. Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon. Again, it's a pleasure to open the last panel of our day today. We have had two interesting sessions on Venezuela and environmental crimes. In this session, as we have announced, we are going to go deeper in the organized crime and the pandemic and the possible trends in the future that the crisis can create in the criminal activity in the future. So I'd like, before introducing our panelists, to uh, provide with two thoughts to introduce the topic, and I'd like to excuse Matthew Charles, postdoctoral researcher. He is in Me Too at field work, and he hasn't been able to uh, get a stable connection for the internet. So I'd like to appreciate his willing to participate and excuse him for the connectivity problems. So I would like to state three ideas about the problem of organized crime during the pandemic that, of course, it will be dealt later by our panelists. Speaking now, thinking out loud, it is not a surprise that restrictions, the lockdown, and measures taken to try to control the expansion of the virus has affected the activities, licit and illicit activities, looking at the commercial flows, the supply chain, among other activities. And the question that maybe states this problem is to which extent the criminal actors have been able to adapt quickly and creatively to some legal actors, even states in the region, uh, responding to this changing the regional and global context. The second thing has to do with the different ways in which the pandemic has reduced some activities of the organized crime. At the same time, it has offered opportunities for the criminal actors dedicated to new activities. Here, I'm thinking of the ways the people trafficking has been affected in some parts of the region and the world due to the air traffic restriction in the borders and people mobility, and uh, drug dealing also has how has been affected. But at the same time, we could think or wonder if the criminal actors, they haven't or not found other opportunities getting into legal activities, investing uh, on sectors in crisis or other sectors which are profitable due to the pandemics or other activities that is not worth it now to mention. Third, and thinking of the future, we have spoken this year about the economic crisis and social crisis due to the pandemics. And basically, here, one of the questions is to which extent the economic contraction, shrinking the employment, the poverty and inequality in a region that is affected, like it is Latin America, the weakening of the state institutions and the increase of governance functions on behalf of the criminal actors, recruiting of minors, lack of security on some states, and the security system impacts the criminal activity in the future. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists that will have more to say about these topics. That for sure we're going to start with Angelica Duran. Angelica is a professor of political sciences of Massachusetts, and she is an author of the book The Politics and Drug Violence, Criminals, Cause, and Politicians in Colombia and Mexico, issued, published by Oscar University Press in 2018, and she has received prizes, award on the International Association for the Study of Organized Crime and the Peter Carlson First for this publication. She is a PhD on Brown University's Political Science, a master's in Latin American Studies in New York University, and a degree in Political Science in the National University of Colombia. And this book is based on her PhD paper, has been published in international and national magazines. Angelica and the rest of panelists will have 7 minutes to be able to speak, and she has told us the kind of questions the conversation will move around. And next, we're going to move on with the questions from the audience. I invite all of you to ask questions in the question section in Zoom. Angelica, thank you very much. Thank you, Arlene. Well, again, thank you very much for the invitation to the University of Rosario, the Observatory as Crime, Inside Crime, Arlene, especially. It is a pleasure for me to be here, be part of the seminar. This morning was very interesting, and I suppose the conversation will be too. So I believe that echoing what Arlene has said, the COVID has had an impact in many of aspects of our lives, and the economies and markets are not the exception. So there are effects that are immediate, other will be long-term, and I believe the long-term will have to do with the economic setback that we have had in the region due to the pandemic. But also this impact vary within the countries and can be sometimes contradictory. So I'd like to speak of 4 points which I think we can think the impact of the pandemic. The first one has to do with the dynamics of the illicit markets. Here, obviously, in some cases, as Arlene said, lockdowns and restrictions of mobility produced limits in some markets. In moving markets, for example, the case of drug dealing affecting the supply chain, for example, making difficult the goods, some drugs like amphetamines, the movement of ships between Mexico and China has created restrictions in the supply chain. For example, it has reduced the levels or the basis of extortion, especially for the gangs in Central America. But on the other hand, I think the pandemic has created opportunities so that some criminal organizations spread, diversify, and to take advantage of this least circulation in case of drug dealing, look for new routes of mobility. So this crisis that we live is extreme, but we have similar experiences from before that shows that the criminal markets and criminal gangs adapt, and they adapt depending on the bigger groups. They have better ease to adapt. Obviously, generally, they end up strengthening after the crisis. The smaller ones, I think, in the juncture, they can move some aleatory random activities. But to show how these impacts sometimes are not so clear as we believe, we wanted to show you some numbers of the drug seizure in the United States. These are from different kinds of drugs, numbers of the CBP, Customs and Border Protection in the United States, since October last year up to this year. Here, what you see is, in general, the impact are not so clear in all the drugs, are not so pronounced as we would like to. In the case of cocaine, as you can see, the orange line, when they start the strongest restriction of mobility in February, March, April, of course, the seizure of cocaine drop, but they come back to their positions in like in November last year. For example, there is an increase in seizure of other drugs. That is interesting because we don't know the meaning of that, but it is just to show that it is not clear that in general, well, it would be a drastic reduction in the seizure because it is necessary to take into account that its seizure could mean different things. But for example, when we see here in the chart, you see the comparison year after year, the different, in blue, we have the cocaine seizure in the United States within the country, and orange is the seizure in the border. What we see here is interesting because in the case of seizure in the border, this fiscal year that we closed, we had more seizures than last year. While we see the seizures within the country, they were reduced, and this shows things that we know a little bit more informally on how the markets have been affected. This drug distribution in the United States due to mobility restriction. Here, the point again of the impacts, I believe, sometimes they are more contradictory of what we know. Quickly, we can elaborate this later. This the impact of COVID in violence, specifically of the organized crime. Here we see different impacts. In some cases, obviously the restrictions reduced homicides when they reduce the recirculation, mobility circulation, but in other cases what we have seen is the restrictions led to an increase of violence, and this could have been in part because of uh, fighting groups can take advantage of the restrictions to gain territory. The important thing is to take into account which are the impact of the violence and the pandemics in the violence depend on the trends that existed in different places before the actors present. And here to illustrate this, I'm showing you the homicide rates this year too of some cities that I selected randomly because those cities carry out some research. So you can see in the case here is Bogota, the gray line, or Medellin, that is this blue line, and we see that when restriction starts of the pandemic in March and April, the homicide lower and they stabilize. Here we have San Salvador. When the restriction starts, there is an increase of violence. After that, it lowers again here, and after that, it keeps stable, and it has increased. But in general, 2020 for sure will be a less violent year than 2019 for the reasons of we can speak later. That Steve has a lot to say later, sure. One of the cases is Ciudad Juarez, the blue line on top, the pandemic in Ciudad Juarez hasn't reduced the level of violence. In the contrary, it has increased. So here I included the case of Tumaco in the Colombian Pacific. I believe it is a city that has brought high violence levels. In the case of other places in Colombia, the pandemic has deepened the violence. For example, Colombia this year with massacres, and it happened in Tumaco. So to clarify, these numbers are the total numbers of homicide. Obviously, this changes when we use rates visually. To close on the other 2 points. I wanted to touch upon how the pandemics have affected the criminal governance. Arlene touched upon this, but it has to do with the fact that we have seen groups that have used their power to regulate communities, to provide them with services. Here again, the important part is to emphasize that those behaviors change through the territories, and it depends on the power these groups had. Different groups, in some cases we don't see these behaviors because the groups don't have the capability or the interest to regulate behaviors. So again, we can speak more about that, but the last point I wanted to mention, obviously, as Arlene mentioned it, an impact, the way in the pandemics affects criminal economies, that through a greater militarization and police abuse that we have had in the context of the pandemic. And I also believe uh, less work from the police can increase opportunities of corruption that in the long term strengthen the illicit economies and criminal organizations. Thank you very much, Angelica. I'm going to give the floor Stephen Darley. He is co-director, co-founder of Cybercrime, of our partner in the organized crime in Colombia. He is a main member of Latin American Center for Studies, the American University of Washington, D.C., was director of the Miami Herald Office for the Andean region and author of two books, Walking Ghosts, Murder and Guerrilla Politics in Colombia, published by Rubbish, and his most recent publication that has just been launched, MS-13, The Making of America's Most Notorious Games, published by Harvard College. So, Steve, you have the floor. Arlene, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to participate again in this, our third conference, annual conference, speaking about main topics on what we have seen through the years and have the participation of many, so many experts on these topics. I'd like to start with thought in general is that I believe that still we are in the stage of assessing the effects. These effects that we see from far, we cannot, it's a COVID effect for us, for researchers, has been that we cannot be in the field. So to get information has been difficult. Having said that, I have three thoughts because everybody has three thoughts. So I have three thoughts too. One is speaking about what Angelica mentioned in the end, the question of criminal governance. I believe that is like the first and maybe the most important thought. They, regarding this during the pandemic, they have extended the power, political power, social power, mainly in the spaces where there is no presence of the state or there's a scarcity of presence of state. The control existed from before, but now it has strengthened. We have seen a lot of examples on this. We can mention in Brazil, since the beginning, there was tweets like Comando Vermelho. They said that this is getting serious. Stay home. In the Salvador, the gangs use their curfews. In Colombia, the guerrillas, current guerrillas and ex-guerrillas, former guerrillas threaten the citizens who defy the strict uh, lockdown in some rural places. In Venezuela, the colectivos started working hand in hand with the government to keep people home. So there were cases remarkable in the media, like the cartel, the Jalisco cartel, with their emblem, logo. It was like jelly, bread, all that. So somehow it's a facade. In certain moments, it could be like a lot of propaganda, but in other places, it's like a reflection of the power that existed in other places. It's an expansion of power. So it's a combination of three things. Really, we cannot um, decodify exactly what it is, but it has to do with all those places. Remember, reading, studying on the construction of state and the famous Charles Tilly that mentioned about organized crime worked hand in hand with the state to create a state. We have had other experts in crime like Banda Ferba Blanc. She mentioned the fact that the organized crime competes with the state. I don't know, but here in the pandemic, we can say that organized crime has helped keep state, at least a social pact minimum to keep sterility. So the first thought. The second thought is that what I said in the Aline said in the beginning, and Angelica, there are people who win, people who lose, and it shows what is going on in the rest of industries. The criminal industries go parallel with the current, the normal industries. If you have to send a product from here to other part of the world, you're going to have problems, mainly if it is illicit product. So that kind of activity can be interrupted. So that's what has happened. Those are the groups in many aspects, the strengthened groups to start. So to survive the pandemics, they will survive the pandemics, but they can suffer disruption regarding the delivery of the product to the market. And we have distribution network at a local level. We have members that are exposed, so they are left to capture. There is cash that has been captured in big amounts, for example, close to the Bolivian border and Argentina, drugs, organic drugs that are getting rotten. They have cut the visits to jails. So the groups inside prisons, they cannot have access to the visits, so they lose their phones, lose access to smuggling, etc. So those are the ones who are losing, but there are other ones that are winning, who are winning. They had in the crime, they were expanding, spreading, but the possibilities, the amount of consumers or people who get in that area of cyber does make they have more possibility for victims. So it is getting, it is spreading, and it will stay after the pandemic, because all that rhythm of working and doing business, that will be kept somehow. So they could be the winners, but anyways, it is difficult to mark the winners now and who are the losers. Lastly, there is a look into the future. I believe that as any group of organized crime, they are looking for, like Jerry likes to say, where there is less resistance. That means that in a place so affected like Latin America, because Latin America has 9% of the population and a third of the people who have died due to COVID, the regional economy will decrease minimum 10%. So there will be many people who are going to be affected, and we can see an increase in certain products that already had existed before, but in a region where 50% of the people worked in the informal sector, that will spread per thousand, times thousand. If before we had three border places like Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, now we will have tens of those places where we going to have a bunch of smuggling and drug dealing. And after that, we hope it be not like that. But if the crisis increase of healthcare economy that caused by a pandemic that will see as a predator group spread, and we're speaking about more extortion, uh, kidnapping, and those kinds of activities. Thank you very much. Last but not least, I'm going to introduce Carolina Sampo. She is a research investigator in Colicet and coordinator of the Studies Center on Organized Crime of the International Relations Affairs of La Plata University. She is a regular professor of the University of Buenos Aires. She is a professor of the PhD of the Institute of International Affairs in La Plata. She has a PhD in social sciences, and she is a bachelor in political sciences at the University of Buenos Aires with a master's in international studies of the Intec University, Carolina. Thank you very much, Arlene. Thank you, the University of Rosario, the Observatory, and Inside Crime for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you and share the platform, in this case with Angelica. That they said many of the things that I had planned to say, but the first one of them is that is important, I think, to highlight. Reality, the crisis due to COVID-19 has deepened trends that were already marked. Everything that has to do with how the organized crime adapted to this new scenario is not new, but it is a deepening of questions that had appeared. The most important ones had to do with the exploitation of a space that was relatively new, but was overspilled by the users of the cyberspace. The second question has to do with the uh, falsification of health goods. Interpol is warning so that the vaccination is allowed. Some of these vaccination, they are asking approval because the criminal organizations would try to mix real drugs with false drugs, and this we have seen from since the beginning when we see the uh, supposedly alleged cure for COVID, but also sanitization. And to that we have added the loans, in short-term loans. In terms of the economic crisis the region is getting into, that depends 50% on the informal economy. But specifically in our case, in South America, we need to understand how drug dealing was affected. Something interesting is that when we mentioned in May about COVID, we thought of a scenario of short and long term. But that scenario started spreading, and it is important to divide two stages the impact the crisis has had, or the pandemic, on the criminal organizations, drug dealing, particularly because in the case of Latin America, we have the only three producers of cocaine in the world, and obviously the illicit activity that is the one that is most important in the region. It is important to mark two in this case. Angelica mentioned three that has to do on how drug dealing moved. In the first stage, what we saw was how the criminal organizations in somehow they went back to those spaces controlled territorially, some of the which exercised the criminal gangs to reinsure the legitimacy provided by their exercise of control of that territory. Why the legitimacy? Somehow they know it becomes a tool of power that can have an impact in the political world. This was given at the first, even though it was kept, but uh, less, some months ago, it was seen like the cartel of Sinaloa. They were sharing, they giving, handing over goods, etc., in the beginning of the lockdowns. And that was seen clearly. The other matter has to do with how they um, readapted faster than the states. And regarding that, they won uh, the race for leadership. So the central question is the closing of borders and the stopping the mobility of the people. The impact was the drug dealing was impacted beyond the borders, but a command to stop the movement has stopped the criminal uh, gangs. That is naive to think of that because the criminal organizations never use the formal borders to move the illicit merchandise. But it is true that the restrictions made it more difficult to move immediately the drug. So it is true that the stopping the state organizations made that step by step, while the pandemic stood, the criminal gangs started to form. It was one of the ways they used to move cocaine, great volumes of cocaine. It was not the only way. They started having a central role. So in January, we started about seizure of 5 tons of cocaine. Last year, we spoke about 1 ton. In November, we are speaking about 11.5 tons of cocaine. So we are somehow seeing the life and survival of these criminal organizations, the adaptation on how to take the drug to a consuming market that pushes, and according to Europol, Europe is the central market of cocaine with this seizure uh, a couple of days ago of 11.5 tons. But it seems to me that what we see here is how criminal organizations have found a way to keep working similar to normality. And at a micro level, it happens what Angelica said of the impact on the criminal organizations was bigger. bigger. When we spoke about mobility through the sea to Europe, they handle big numbers of cocaine. In the case of the terrain, the daily basis, micro traffic, the impact could have been bigger for sure. But we are not going to know about this because the numbers of 2020 will not be trusted. Well, they are never trusted, but in this case, we have more to suspect. But for sure, it could increase. What we see is the use of alternative means, for example, the delivery, the sales through WhatsApp and internet sites, etc. This only to start. The rest, if you want, we can discuss during the Q&A session. Thank you. Thank you, Carolina. I'm going to offer for a next round where we are going to have 5 minutes. I'm checking the questions that we have received. I'd like to offer that we focus on this round on the uh, adaptation to the crisis, the changes in the criminal landscape that we see this year from crisis, and this next round, now that we have mentioned the criminal governance, we will dedicate a little bit to that and other questions that we might receive. There are specific questions that I would like to mention, and you will decide which you will answer. Angelica has shown charts with statistics on seizures and homicides. And I'd like to give her the opportunity to think a little more in detail about this, the meaning of these facts. We observed peaks around the start of the lockdown, then changes, but there is variation according to the place, the illicit substance in question, and what could that mean? It's a question that is written in the chat. We are in the process of assessing the impact of the pandemic regarding the criminal activities and everything that maybe is not a speculation but incomplete statements. So, secondly, we haven't referred to the use of spaces, of virtual spaces, as a way to spread and adapt to crisis, including cybercrime that Carolina mentioned, the participation in e-commerce that also has been exploited this year. That is another question. The charts Angelica showed suggest somehow that criminal violence has kept during the pandemic. And somebody is asking if that means that the controls, state controls on violence and criminal activity has been affected or not due to the pandemics. That is the behavior of the criminal activity, except with some exceptions. It indicates that about the policies on of control of the criminal activity. Regarding the diversification of the criminal activity that we have mentioned us, there is a question on the fact that if the criminal groups will start dedicate to the theft and smuggling of medicine, I think that is happening. And even even if the vaccine comes to our countries, we are not clear on when that's going to happen. So, what kind of criminal dynamics have won, which have lost or haven't won due to what is going on in the region? If you agree, let us continue with the same order for the first round. Angelica starts, and after the round, we will change the order. So we have important issues, and I agree with Steve. I'd like to emphasize that we need to be careful not to, when we reach into conclusions, because we are assessing these things on the facts and variations. I believe one of the reasons we wanted to show the facts is because we believe that the impact of the restrictions sometimes are not so radical as we would have thought, at least with certain indicators. Obviously, the meaning of seizures is an indicator that it can be complicated because it could mean either the state is strengthening the actions or a greater volume of trafficking. And obviously, there is a black number that is enormous because there is an amount of traffic that never stops. Nevertheless, assuming there is stability in the way we control statistics, for example, with the seizure number I showed you, it is clear that even though there is a drop, if you compare the facts towards the previous year in the border, we see the increase and drop. So there is an impact due to the things we have discussed. But I believe that in part the message behind this is to show this graphic, the impact, at least in terms of circulation of drugs, hasn't been so radical. But this could change depending on the place we are talking about. Again, here in the United States, there is a discussion. There has been an increase, there was an increase in the price of the drugs in the streets because there was less availability. That has increased the prices a lot. But for example, the price of coke in the Andean countries has lowered. That price not only has lowered due to the pandemics, but the price of the coke leaves was lowering, and it has to do with the excess of offer. There is a difference between the moment in the supply chain of different products we are referring to. So if we speak about the levels of production and transit and final markets regarding the violence, the same. I believe with violence, it is possible that in some cases the pandemic, specifically the initial lockdowns, had a clear impact in some cases in the bigger cities where most of violence is less associated directly to criminal struggles. We can say, think in Bogota. In those cases, mobility restrictions had an impact in reducing violence precisely because there were more people from abroad. So in other cases, in many rural areas of Colombia, they had violence before, and there is criminal struggle. So mobility restriction, maybe they caused an opening for opportunity for those struggles to increase, to occupy territory. So to be able to assess clearly and conclude on the relationship of the lockdowns and violence, I believe we need to analyze carefully with more variables, because I believe in general my answer would be the pandemics has had an effect, but it is not an effect that is separate from other things that had happened before. Why we have kept violence and what is the meaning of that in the control, state control. Personally, I have a bigger question. I believe we need to, when we think of the impact of the pandemic in the violence and organized crime, we need to pay attention to what happened with the presence of state, what has happened with the presence of state. Regarding that, I believe there are many things operating. The first one is initially there is a change focus on pandemic, so I don't believe it is too much of the situation, current situation. Shows finally that the state hasn't changed the framework on how they face the organized crime with or without pandemic, and it is important to see how the state agents has the amount has changed and how that is related to the levels of violence. That is an open question. And regarding the dynamics that have won and who have lost, again, it depends on the territories. Which have won, Steve said, up to a certain point, groups that had a little of control in the territory, maybe they have strengthened. And you see that in Latin America, Central America, Mexico, Brazil. In Colombia, I believe it is not so clear because many criminal struggles, but some of the things that they have won is the ability to control the territory from the armed groups. It implies of what we know about the criminal governance that it has faced, that is benefit for the citizens. What it means that some of the things, as Carolina said, that have spread are activities of low level that affect the citizens in a daily basis. For example, the credit or the control of the market. And who have won? I wanted to say this to close. Dynamics we haven't mentioned, something that has spread with the pandemic is the corruption compared to regarding the agreements with health services that have increased during the pandemic. And these generally are not markets that are controlled or not by criminal groups, but it's corruption form ways that are big. Despite the fact that it is not organized crime, those markets have increased in corruption. They have spread, and they don't have to do with traditional markets, illegal markets, but they show at a level in which the corruption in state is a main variable to understand the impact of the pandemic and which could be the impact of the pandemic in the long term. I don't know if still I have time. No, no, not at all. See, we go with the next round. Well, there are many questions and issues. I will only touch upon three of them because I like to keep the number three. And speaking on agility, the question of if organized crime, quote, obviously we are speaking about a monster of thousand heads, but organized crime is more agile. But the hand to mouth belongs to all of us. We have seen certain ways they do the hand to mouth. And as an example, the where people when they sell in cash, they don't have a free access to customers. So they need to invent ways to reach the customers. And ironically, they have done the same of the rest with a pick away. They can pick the truck wherever they are, and they have had the delivery, but they have had they have camouflaged ambulances to be able to transport drugs. They have camouflaged themselves, essential workers, to deliver food or medicine. A great amount of possibilities for these kinds of groups. The way they act, it is important locally because we are saying that the space where they operate and sell their products has reduced, and that might be changing with the lockdown and the population that got tired of the lockdown. They do not abide by the rules and they open the spaces. But in the beginning, we speak about reduced spaces and how they did the hand to mouth to survive in the reduced spaces. And there has been an increase of criminal activities that have to do with the economic situation, directly with the economic situation. When the family they lose their job, you look for ways to replace the money you are not earning. And what we have seen is an increase, and we are speaking about seizures, so there's nothing scientific on that, but major seizure of flora and fauna. They are criminal economies with a low bar, so they can get in, increase their production, quote, that it would be to cut off more wood and sell more in the market. That is logical in the economic situation that we are. Then there is there are other ones taking advantage of the pandemic for other criminal activities that didn't exist before, sell certain kinds of medicine or have a black market of important PPP, equipment for hospitals, masks, but those are individuals. It is not organized crime. Likewise, the people who are cutting off the wood, there is the lowest scale of the chain. They are getting in because of the situation, but there could be a criminal activity because there is always the need, and the consumption of drugs can increase due to the um, small drug dealing, and you accumulate drugs in certain places, and there could be an increase of consumption. The increase of consumption of drugs can be left for after the coronavirus, and that could be a long lasting effect of coronavirus. Lastly, I'd like to mention what Angelica touched upon, that it is like it always happens, that we are not surprised by that, but likewise, we are angry for that corruption, the everyday corruption of the political elites and economic elites when they form their groups, elite groups amongst themselves, and they have agreements to import certain machinery, certain drugs or medicine, and they steal the state, and that has increased a lot, and that is organized, pure organized and simple uh, theft. And it is not our everyday basis, but we can notice that we are speaking about governability of the criminals. So you are legitimizing other actors because you are acting as a corrupt and a criminal, as a state. And that does have a collateral effect with the image of the states in a way that you are not complying with your role in the state. And apart from that, you are stealing, taking advantage of the misery situation, legitimizing some actors. And so I finish. Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. Carolina. Thank you very much. So many things to say, but such a short time. Basically, I'd like to go deeper in the idea of diversification that appeared between among the questions. It is important to understand that in the criminal organizations, they don't dedicate to only one unique activity in general. Most of activities, criminal activities that we mentioned, the smuggling, the products, counterfeiting of products, people trafficking, they go hand in hand according, depending on the territorial space and the organization we're speaking about, they will have more value and they will have more priority to one activity than the other one. Regarding that, it is true that the pandemics opened the possibility for a space that is new, that is cybercrime. As Arlene said a while ago, e-commerce, mainly the risks in e-commerce of many people that were not used to use internet as a space to interact with others and purchase, etc. Their criminal organizations have taken advantage of that situation. But it doesn't mean that some activities regarding drug trafficking stopped, the ones that have to do with smuggling and people trafficking. And here there's a recent report from last month, November, of the United Nations, where they state clearly how this situation of crisis in the economy and the society due to the pandemic generate spaces that allow or would allow eventually to complicate the situation for the people trafficking. And one of the things in the report has to do with the informal loans at a low rate that somehow open a door for work in conditions of modern slavery, so to say. So I am interested also in uh, mentioning of seizure, the power of the state, mentioned by Steve and Adeline. It is an indicator that it is a little complicated because sometimes you don't know what the numbers say. In this particular context where I believe the states have shown there is a standby, at least for some months, the seizures seem to show more activity in the illicit goods trafficking of cocaine, particularly, and mainly the volume, as I said in the beginning, is not a minor question. A year ago, we spoke about a ton of cocaine per shipment. In March, we mentioned 5 tons. In November, a month ago, it was 11 tons. We see clearly that criminal organizations decide to take the risk because they know that it is not probable, they are intervened in the way. Regarding this, I think it is important to strengthen what Steve said, not looking at only corruption, that it is one of the enabling factors, but mainly impunity, because there where somehow the one that does things incorrectly pays for the consequences, it is more difficult, more costful to get into a corruption act. But in spaces like ours in Latin America, where those who incur in corruption acts or other kinds that violate the laws, they don't have any kind of punishment. So we reproduce their behavior. And somehow Steve mentioned about these policies. Parallel to that, it is important to highlight that the civil society is tired not only about the situation linked to the pandemic and the crisis and lockdowns, but also the lack of um, the political class, and there is a lack of competition by the legitimacy. And I'm going to stop there because Arlene mentioned that next round will be about criminal governance, and we'll comment on that later. Very good. I believe we have 17 minutes, so we will have two rounds. I will ask the next round to be shorter intervention so that we can group as many questions as possible. So as I told you, I would like to think of the criminal governance issues and the institutional power of the state. And here there is a battery of questions that I will try to answer, or to sum up for the. We have mentioned several times about criminal governance. I'd like to ask if anybody could specify what term makes reference to a short definition of criminal governance. Secondly, when we analyze the proliferation of groups in the region, there are several questions in Brazil and Peru about the approach between criminal groups emerging and the ones that are settled already that the pandemic has enabled. One of the examples is between Venezuela and Brazil, for example. And regarding this, if we have seen new forms of interaction at a national level and transnational as well between groups due to the factors associated to the pandemic. In terms of the institutional weakness of the state, up to which extent we could say that the increase in the space of criminal governance have contributed to the weakness of the state. Another question, for example, regarding the current security policies, to which extent the new roles of the security forces in the region linked to the pandemic are affecting the combat against the organized crime, to which extent the role deviation could contribute to bigger corruption of security forces. Regarding the weakness of the state, I'd like to mention something that Stephen mentioned in the first intervention. Steve, you said that the organized crime, it has deepened the weakness of the state, but also has served to justify and keep state. And I believe this leads to a question about the justification of militarization and strengthening of the repression group the threat of this organized crime can lead to. The question is if this generates a perverse effect, meaning the more militarization, the more strengthening of the repression group of state, maybe less attention from state to the structural problems that have worsened due to the pandemic. And there is a vicious circle in terms of the strengthening of state, and we agree that we require to uh, face, tackle many problems of the organized crime in the region. And to make the answer complex, a little bit more complex, there is a question on the private interest in Latin America, among others, the activities of the transnational companies regarding the question of the sector of energy and telecommunications. But while as long as there is a diversification of the criminal portfolio, can we expect of more um, damage to the private actors? So we are going to start the other way around this time. I'm going to give the floor to Carolina first. We do not expect everyone to answer, but we would like to be selective when we answer. We have 3 minutes maximum for this round. Okay, thank you. First, the question on criminal governance in general. There is a lot of discussion on this matter is to establish an alternative social order where the criminal organization provides with public services such as the distribution of food, cleansing products, up to provision of security, justice through extrajudicial executions, and those territorial spaces here where the organized crimes exercises what we call criminal governance. It seems interesting, this stated by Arlene about how the interaction between the criminal organization, either at a local level or national level, has been modified, and transnational level too. Regarding that, the approach of criminal groups, small, emerging ones with ones that have settled. In the cases I work with the most, like in Brazil, it seems not probable upstream if it doesn't uh, happen with a big group like the PCC towards small groups, the ones who are more affected, hit by the pandemic in the field, and maybe they need to go to bigger structures to survive. Regarding the uh, criminal organizations linked to other organizations beyond the regional borders, in the case of PCC, we are speaking about collaborations in Africa, Western Africa, and Europe, some places in Europe in the prisons that spread not only within Brazil but in Paraguay and Bolivia. I think it's something we need to pay attention to. And I'm interested, last, to leave some space for the rest to place on the table this discussion on if more legitimacy of the space when there is criminal governance or territorial control implies necessarily state weakness. I'm not sure that it is like that. Not necessarily it's A1 plus 0. There is certain cooperation between the political elites and the criminal organizations, and in the end, none of them want to disappear. So it seems that the organized crime as a way to commit a crime overlaps the democracy. I am not so sure that brings about a bigger state weakness. Thank you very much, Carolina. Steve? Well, so many topics. The idea to keep state, I admit it's like exaggeration, but somehow state is like in many cases a fiction in many of these places. And what we saw with the beginning of coronavirus, more and more, there were alliances between or among political groups and criminal groups. Those alliances were made through economic business, of course, but also political business. And at a point where there is a scarcity of certain things, a need on one side, mainly on the side of the state, the politicians, the elites, they are going to look more and more for these alliances. And this is the concern I have because the region and the world will go out of the pandemics, but the effect of the pandemic will be kept in certain regions for long time than in other regions of the world. And I think Latin America is one of the regions that will live or with the effects of pandemics longer than the rest. And what it does is to open more spaces for that kind of alliances that I do believe the politicians and the strong economic groups do see a game of U plus zero, and it is dangerous because it strengthens the alliances in the long term. And that can be the uh, cumulative effect that we are going to have out of the pandemics, uh, strong alliance between criminal groups that could have more capital or access to certain places to get votes or access to other markets. It could be a great amount of possibilities offered by a criminal group to other groups to be able to keep their own power or spread their power within the spaces post pandemic. And that is what concerns me. Thank you very much, Steve. Angelica, I will add another question if you wish to answer. There is a question that is interesting on the indicators that allow to state that there is a criminal governance. I know you work on that, so it could be relatively easy to add that to your answer. I believe something interesting is that we have more people working on this governance, criminal governance in detail, but the indicators of criminal governance that we can compare do not exist. There is more people speaking, trying to collect them, because generally we need to have work close to the communities to see exactly what the groups do. But a group of researchers in Medellin a while ago, they issued an effort they have made to try to measure the criminal governance. And what we do, we are basically asking the communities, documenting the kind of behaviors they see in the armed groups. And there is something that is important apart to understand this governance issue. Many groups do things at the same time, and there's others that just carried out uh, some activities. They manage the dispute in the territory. They provide with justice in Brazil. For example, they provide with parties in the community, and in other cases, some groups do some of those things, but not all of at the same time. This leads me to elaborating more on what you were commenting, keeping the line of Carolina mentioned the effect of this criminal governance in the capability of the state. In general, I understood always the crime, and I believe that there are cases where we can speak about the state absence. In general, we cannot understand the organized crime without understanding the state and the fact that the presence of state generally and the alliances of the agents of state or the way they exercise the control of law affect the dynamics of organized crime. So obviously there is a weakness, and I believe in the cases where we have criminal governance that is extends even though they are associated to relationship between politicians and criminals and the police and criminals in the long term, that weakens what we understand the ideal of state. I don't know if it exists, but a state that has a legitimacy of the community that solve disputes, and it is complex. I would like to briefly speak about two examples. In Medellin, for example, where I have done a lot of work and remotely this summer. But we have this situation in Medellin where there is levels of criminal governance that are localized, but rooted in the communities in a context where you could think of state that is strong. There is a present state, there are services, but nevertheless you see the coexistence between these criminal governance and the presence of state. In Salvador, for example, it is clear that the gangs within the pandemic, they have spread their criminal governance strongly on communities, but at the same time there has been a great expansion of the power of state, militarized repression power, but apart from the increase of the criminal governance precisely due to relationship between state actors and the leadership of the gangs to the point they have expanded. And if we think of this relationship between the institutionality of the state and the criminal governance, it is complicated. As Carolina said, it is not a game of U plus zero. What I would like to say lastly is that one of the questions is to which extent the roles of the police, deviation of roles, change of roles can increase the possibilities of corruption. For me, I believe it is one of the effects which we have mentioned in the pandemic is the fact that one of the things I believe can strengthen in this process of the corruption network due to different reasons for the discretional power of police due to spaces created during the crucial moments of the lockdown to provide with the discretion of police to certain sectors of security. So I believe precisely with those relationship between criminal actors and politicians are essential. The challenge that we see is to try to think how we think of criminals as criminals, but also the interactions with the politicians and the state that keeps them operating. Thank you very much, Angelica. Let's take a couple of minutes, more than 5:15, to try to uh, cultivate, if you agree. So it's a quick intervention, only 2 minutes. The question, what we can wait for, we expect for next year regarding trend and organized crime, and once the restriction is raised and there is a vaccination, will something change? We will have to carry out a second event, that is the factor United States, that we haven't mentioned, but it has an impact on the policies against organized crime. So both questions would be how this could affect the trends and policies, the change of government in January, and if the problem in the consumption market of illicit substances in the United States affects the trends of crime here. Third, the increasing importance of social media, the small drug smuggling, will they keep or they start depleting once we overcome this critical stage of the pandemic? And lastly, the inability of the state to satisfy the needs, increasing needs of population in different countries of Latin America due to the crisis for the pandemic, that leads to an empowering of criminal actors, or the trends could be similar. For this, I'll give the floor to Steve. Oh, so easy questions. Well, I really, we are somehow grabbing things that we can feel, because obviously we have been locked at home. We suppose what's going on outside home, but we don't know exactly. I believe that we're going to find many more things of what we expect, but in general terms, what I expect, I don't know exactly if I expect, but what I think is going to happen is what I said before. The pandemic will take more time. The effect of the pandemics will be felt for longer time in Latin America than in other parts of the world. That will generate a kind of alliance. We are speaking about criminal governance, so we should also be speaking about what my friend says, governments that are criminals. And that is what we see, the effect to survive what is to come, not only in the end of the pandemics, but what goes on later. They will have to take certain spaces where there are criminals. So I repeat what I said before, 50% of the current economy or before the pandemic in Latin America, it was informal. So you can imagine the amount of informality that will exist later. That is what concerns me more, and with that I close. Aline, thank you very much. Thank you, Carolina. Your last minute, I believe, somehow, as Steve says, there are many things left. The feeling is that people fear, so they are getting used to live like this. So I am not so sure that at the moment everybody gets a vaccine, it will be so easy to leave jail and leave the practices that we are used to. Regarding the inability of the state to satisfy the needs of the population, I think the core question has to do with the economic problems, the social impact of the economic crisis, the fall of the GDP generated this year that will keep for a couple of years, and what was called the proletariat of the organized crime. I think there is an important question that is the recruiting to which the organization or criminal organizations can appeal, considering the informality levels of Latin American economies and the inability of states of taking all places at the same time, not only the pandemic, the sanitary crisis, but the economic and social crisis. So I believe that we need to pay attention to all the who could be central agents like women in communities to avoid the advance of organized crime. Thank you very much, Carolina. Angelica, to finish, I will speak about the United States, about the change of government. I would believe that in many dimensions it's a good change, but there are certain aspects that can change radically and some others don't. So for what we are speaking, what I believe it can change that can be important for the region of organized crime. I would expect that the new government is prone to support efforts that have had positive aspects in the region. The processes, in processes in Guatemala, hand in hand with the justice in Honduras, to tackle criminality in the relationship between politicians and the criminals, and some processes that had the support of the United States, they lost the support during this administration, and they can take it again with the Biden administration. The same will happen with the case of the peace process in Colombia that has implications regarding illicit economies. And again, the Biden's economy government would be prone to support the peace process, which maybe has positive implications for the criminal economies. In other cases, it is not clear that the government will move radically, for example, in terms of migration policies that we didn't touch upon, but it is another big issue in the borders between the United States and Mexico. One of the policies of the migrants in the border has generated great situations between the United States and Colombia. And regarding that, we will create more opportunities to strengthen the organized crime if those policies will go back to the people seeking for asylum in the Mexican border would have positive implications. But in the case of the Biden administration will change the policies in the short term. So I believe there are many things that can be favored and some others don't. So with that, I finish. Thank you very much, Angelica. We will have another event next year, as long as the policies next year will clarify. So with that, we close the discussion. I would like to appreciate Angelica, Carolina, Steve for the discussion that for me has been fascinating, to appreciate our uh, audience, and I will give the word to our master of ceremony who will close the event. Thank you very much, Arlene. I'd like to appreciate Arlene, Angelica, Carolina, Steve for joining us and sharing their thoughts. We have finished the third international seminar, COVID and Crime, the Evolution of Organized Crime in America 2020. We appreciate the attendees, moderators, panelists for joining us today, and also the ones who followed us through Facebook Live and the social media, interacted with the hashtag Crimen Organizado Latam, the organizers, the members, um, uh, officials of the Observatory Inside Crime, the University of Rosario. Thank you very much for your commitment, presence, and contribution. Remember that the memoirs of the event will be found in YouTube channel, Inside Crime, and blog of the Observatory. We wish a happy afternoon for you.